Hi folks, you're with Tassus today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for joining this live stream. Now in this chat I'd like to talk about human evolution in the context of enlightenment. And when I say enlightenment, I'm talking about some form of representative government with the consent, or that seeks the consent of the people, rule of law, due legal process, law of contract, property law, all the sort of things that make a stable, wealthy, affluent society where power is arbitrated and outcomes are largely at least agreed to by the various governing parties, but with the consent of the governed. So that's the standpoint. Now, if we look back sort of through recorded history, most tribes or cities, towns, villages, and so on had some sort of council. It could be council of elders. It could be some form of elections to decide councillors and things like that. Typically, it was built on not simply just power, but age and wisdom and so on. And these councils would meet and make decisions that were largely binding on the rest of the people. So this waxed and waned over time. So at its height, you had Athenian democracy in ancient Athens, where they had an assembly and they had voting, but these tended to be the better off citizens. And the view at the time was the more skin you had in the game, the more you were risking, the more that was on the table, the greater the say you should have. It didn't mean the others were denied a say, but it meant that the councils, be they democratic in a number of ways, they did represent, or the people came from a fairly small proportion of the population, but excellence was still admired. Oratory, of course, was admired in those days, in fact still is now. And so the concept of democracy there was, if the assembly wanted to vote, they would vote yes or no on something, and they take either a white stone or a dark stone, and then would put it in. The stones would be counted, and the majority would prevail. Even in ancient Athens, there were still times when they didn't think that democracy was working, and they would look at a dictator and give the dictator dictatorial powers. One such person in ancient Greece was a guy called Draco, and the basis of the word draconian comes from this dude. And he was kind of hired, if you like, he was sort of installed as a dictator to write new laws that would be unbiased, would be objective, and would not be influenced by one lobby group or another, or anyone. That they would be done completely independently for the benefit of the civis. And this was fairly novel. Draco was an enlightened guy. He realized that the power he had was pretty enormous, and that if he stayed in that position as dictator, even though he was installed there by the assembly or by the people, that if he stayed in that role, he would be corrupted, and he would eventually succumb to the delusions and the grandeurs and all the other things that go along with unrestricted power. And he said, no, now I've done the laws, now I've laid it all out, I'm gonna head off and have a long vacation. You guys now run it with your assembly. The assembly didn't necessarily share that view and thought, well, no, you're doing a good job so far, so why don't you stay there? And the various factions of the assembly, of course, were worried that the wrong faction would take control or would take some supreme position or something like that. So they wanted him to stay as the independent guy, but he realised that he'd be corrupted by the power, as nearly all humans are, and so he went. I mean, it's an interesting thing. He tries to get into his boat and sail off, and the assembly sends heavies and goons around at spear point to say, you're not going anywhere, buddy, you're the dictator, you're staying. And it's kind of an irony there. You just imagine that scene unfolding, and the Piraeus docks or something. So anyway, that's the when once ancient Athens in the Peloponnesian War of in the early 400s, I think it's 425 down to 404 BC from off the top of my head. Once ancient Athens had kind of been knocked out of the supreme position, the concept of democracy, certainly as it was expressed then, declined. That didn't mean that there weren't tribal assemblies or things like that, but say in ancient Sparta that was supreme there for a while, the assembly was actually really the main decision-making body, was sort of 7 or 9 people. So again, the participation was small, and the ideas of upholding rule of law or due legal process or things like that, they were kind of, but it wasn't important. It wasn't seen as fundamental, or even property law for that matter. And there were various sections of society, particularly the lower orders, that were thought, why should they have any rights? So there were those sorts of things, and then it sort of went around to really just small councils that were making decisions. But before democracy expanded again to take in a large amount of people, it really was ancient Rome where that began again. Not that there weren't outliers here and there were, but in terms of prominent sort of all-encompassing type systems of government, the Romans came in, and they had, of course, the Senate, and again, mainly the landed classes that were there, but there was still social mobility in Rome. For example, freed slaves could rise up through the public service and become quite influential. And so this idea of representative democracy, even though it was limited, and the idea of a court that was independent judiciary and things like that, the rule of law, Roman courts were considered the place where you went in those times if you wanted a fair, impartial, independent hearing based on the law. So, and then the Romans also, in terms of engineering, their engineering feats were considerable. So there was, the society as a whole advanced immeasurably during that time. Technologically, in social organisation, in framing of laws, practice of law, and all sorts of things like that. And that created a huge and flourishing middle class. And the city of Rome, of course, having a population of more than 1 million people back in the day. So it was the centre of certainly the Mediterranean-based and European-based universe. Then when the Roman Empire fell, a lot of these things, the engineering, the upkeep, the maintenance of all sorts of public buildings and public roads, that all went to shit. But also the practice of law, when the idea of an independent court would have been laughable in many places in the Middle Ages. Things became either just war, warlike factions trying to kill each other. You took what you wanted when you could, and Rome was seen as a beacon. All the tribes of sort of the known world at that time all wanted to come to Rome to loot it, to sack it, to so on, and take whatever they could. But the concept of wealth creation by law and by social organisation was something that these people didn't really grasp. So you have all these hordes, the Huns and the Visigoths and all sorts of things like that coming into Italy. And Rome went from a population of over 1 million people to, within a couple of hundred years, a population of less than 30,000. It was a dirt poor, bankrupt, on the bones of his ass city there, or town, village even at one point. But it had gone from being the wealthiest centre of the world into being just some impoverished little town. Because there was no underpinning of social organisation and democracy, consensus, all these sorts of things that make up a wealthy society. And before that was rediscovered, that idea of not just the technology that some of the Romans were the Romans came very close to developing steam engines, for example. So they hadn't worked out the technology of creating a boiler that could withstand the pressure needed to deliver the amount of steam that could, say, drive an engine or drive something down a track and so on. But it was a close run thing. You wonder if the Romans had stayed in business, whether they would have achieved that sometime around 600 or 700 AD. But nonetheless, looking at these the social organisation required to underpin wealth, that wasn't really rediscovered in terms. You could see pockets of it, say again in Italy, by the way. So the Venetian traders and that sort of thing, they did very well, and you could see pockets of it as well around parts of Spain. Little examples of it around parts of Britain and so on. But the idea of a society that could get together around democratic principles, rule of law principles, due legal process principles, property, all these things, that didn't really principles, rule of law principles, due legal process principles, property, all these things, that didn't really take off again in any meaningful way until the Industrial Revolution took off. So you have this hiatus of almost 1,200 years or thereabouts, where all that was lost, and again, small outlier pockets here and there, but it was really Britain then that took up the cudgels in the modern era and rediscovered these things. Now, the rest of the Western polities also rediscovered in various so on. To go down the path of rule of law, democracy, consensus government, and so on and so forth. They're all the richest countries in the world, but these are very rare. Most of the countries in the world don't have that and are proportionally much poorer. Most have a very, very small rich elite, and that's really the default position of history and around the world. And that's where I think the West is returning to. I think it's going back to that sort of default situation and the enlightenment of those things. The democratic principles and the involvement. It's seen as no longer serving the interests of the globalists to whatever extent it did, and it's now not. We don't need that anymore. What we need is a new system that suits us, and what we have to do as the people. And bear in mind, the globalists have infiltrated every single institution that would and should and was actually designed to protect and uphold all these principles of the democratic principle, participation, voting, rule of law, and so on and so forth. They've infiltrated every single one, and they've got control. So we have to start taking principles of the democratic principle, participation, voting, rule of law, and so on and so forth. They've infiltrated every single one, and they've got control. So we have to start taking back these institutions, and we need to return to consensus government. Now, whether it's exactly the same form of consensus government that we had certainly from the 20s onwards, and bear in mind too, by the way, universal franchise, everyone gets the vote. That's quite new. That in historical terms, this is the first. From 1920 onwards was the first time ever in history that it's been practiced, that universal franchise. And the only reason that happened was because of the mass mobilisation of all the nation's resources in World War I and, of course, again in World War II. So even then, the globalists, or what would have been the ruling cabal, thought, well, we're going to need all these people to work. We're going to need them to lay their lives down in wars, and we've got to give them something, so let's give them the vote. That's that, which is quite reasonable, by the way. That's not an unreasonable sort of position to take. A bit like giving 18-year-old men the vote because they lay their lives down on, say, as frontline soldiers, in Vietnam and Korea and elsewhere. So it's quite reasonable to give 18-year-olds the vote if you're going to ask them to lay their life down. Now, whether it's the new, if we do manage to take back the vote and the voting rights and government by consensus, I'm not sure that universal franchise would exist. Or will exist in the future. There'll be somewhere around 75% of the population will get to vote, maybe a little bit less, but somewhere around there. And then there'll be selective designation of those who have a right to vote. For example, if an 18-year-old is drafted into the army or joins the army, engages in frontline service, then they should have the right to vote. And that is something I think would probably happen in the future. I think once democracy is lost, and I think we're about there now, really, in reality, if the globalists can't make sure that only their candidates get voted for, they'll just rig the election. So it's effectively neutralised democracy anyway. if we take it back to be truly representative, then I don't think universal franchise will exist as it did. I think that was an aberration that was directly related to mass mobilised warfare, all resources of the state, and I think that giving of the vote simply reflected that, and the globalists don't need that anymore. The following wars probably won't be as they would see it, and maybe it's going to be all electronic and all people sitting in rooms holding boots on the ground sort of warfare is something we can't rule out. I just view it as less likely going forward. But even so, the other than the wars, and the communist bloc and that sort of thing, for the West, at least, really the last 10 years, say, so that too played a big role of that. Also the West, Britain, Australia, Canada, and so on. Now that's all being frittered away at a rate of knots, and we're losing all of those things. Democracy, rule of law, due legal process. I know I bang on about this in other videos, but it is so critically important that the issue isn't transgender bathrooms, it's not racist tweets, it's these are the bedrock issues. And we're being distracted as a nation by the media that the globalists own into fixating on things like transgender bathrooms or whether George Floyd was a martyr or not, and these types of absurd things, when in reality all our wealth, our rights, purchasing power, everything is being stripped away, and we're none of the people that are supposed to stop this or talk against it are doing it. So it's really coming back to us to do something. So these are the times. So enlightenment isn't something that just happens on an upward trajectory. It goes backwards, it goes sideways, it goes forwards, it goes up, it goes down. Maybe overall, in the total scheme of things over the thousands of years, it does improve. But right now, it's in reverse, and we need to do something about it. You've been with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.